The K-pop Demon Hunters sequel could take the story in countless different directions, but based on the way the first movie was written, I think that there are only a few core paths the sequel can realistically follow. And while each component of the story holds endless possibilities for where they could go, the main plot is somewhat limited, if we assume that the sequel will honor what the first movie established. The biggest thing that will impact the plot of the sequel is the status of the honeymoon. If the honeymoon is in fact entirely golden at the end of the first movie, then that would mean that the hunters won and that the demons can no longer get into the human world. The hunters would likely still need to maintain the honeymoon, but with demons no longer posing a threat, it should be relatively easy for the seasoned Huntrix girls. This movie could explore their relationship to their work, now that the world has been saved and their lives are beginning to change. They would still create songs and release new albums, but something about it would start to feel different. For the first time, they might begin asking themselves what kind of lives they want beyond being K-pop idols and demon hunters. Since the role of being a K-pop demon hunter had defined their entire lives, they would eventually have to confront an unfamiliar question. What happens after retirement? Do they pursue a new career, start families, or move on to something entirely different? Although with the money that they have, they could just retire to Jeju Island and spend the rest of their lives just drinking mojitos on the beach. But let's be real here. The likelihood of the sequel going in this direction, of actually having the honeymoon be entirely golden, is less likely than me marrying EJ. Because the writers wouldn't want to limit themselves to not having the hunters be able to fight demons anymore. Also, a story centered around choosing a different path later in life doesn't really resonate with the younger side of the audience. Though this direction could potentially work better if the project evolves into a movie series, since the younger audience that grew up watching K-pop Demon Hunters would likely be adults by the time this movie would come out. Okay, I'm kidding, but that would be a pretty funny idea. But realistically, this kind of sequel, or sequel, is not happening. What will most likely happen is that the honeymoon isn't actually fully golden, or that even if the honeymoon is golden, that it doesn't seal demons away entirely. The golden honeymoon would just make it more difficult for the demons to infiltrate the human world. And with that, there is also a wider range of options this story could take, one of which would be a military intervention by the Korean government. Because of the events of the first movie, the Korean government became aware of demons. As a result, they begin working with the hunters to stabilize the honeymoon. The Korean government, and in fact all the governments of the world, would be critical at Celine and the Huntrix girls about the fact that they didn't ask for their help, with the fate of the world being on the verge of a demon apocalypse. Celine could justify it by saying that government intervention would eventually turn demons into tools for weapons programs, and bring political agendas and bureaucracy into demon hunting, which is why the hunters decided to stay secret. The Korean government could publish positive articles about Huntrix and heavily promote them in order to strengthen the honeymoon, since the more fans Huntrix has, the stronger the honeymoon becomes. However, taking the story in this direction would also expose a major plot hole from the first movie, one that is too big to ignore. The Korean government wouldn't actually need to aggressively market Huntrix. All they would need to do is make a simple public broadcast saying, "Support Huntrix and become fans, or the world could face a demon apocalypse." Once people would learn that Huntrix's popularity was literally what kept demons from invading, most people would just start supporting them naturally. The only counter-argument to this could be that if people knew about the song's abilities to seal demons away, the magic would stop working, because people would be supporting Huntrix out of necessity, rather than genuine choice. However, that starts venturing into confusing territory as to how the honeymoon's magic actually functions. But again, I think we can agree that the sequel won't be going in this direction either, because we can reasonably infer that the writers want to keep the Korean government and the rest of the world unaware of demons, allowing the story to remain centered around the hunters, which is also a direction that I personally would prefer. The only reason I would want the sequel to explore this other path is because it creates tangible real-world consequences for the events of the first movie, though that can still be averted with the Harry Potter Obliviate angle. Another direction this story could take is having Kima create a new rival K-pop group or even recast the Saja boys. Since this was by far the demon's most successful strategy, ignoring it entirely would be inconsistent. It could come across as repeating the first movie, but from a continuity standpoint, it would make perfect sense. Unless Kima decides to take a different approach and have demons infiltrate the Korean government, planting false evidence against Huntrix, such as accusations of tax evasion, or simply launching a campaign to damage Huntrix's public image. As we already saw in the first movie, when the Huntrix girls become entangled in drama, the honeymoon literally falls apart. However, this direction could still feel too similar to the first movie, which is why I doubt the sequel would fully go with this kind of plot. But there is another possible core plot direction that I personally would prefer most. A direct invasion of the demon realm. Once Celine and the Huntrix girls discover that the Golden Honeymoon is not enough to fully eliminate the demon threat, they realize that simply defending their world is no longer an option. They would have to take the fight to Kima himself. Because Rumi is half demon, she could potentially travel to the demon realm and bring Mira and Zoe with her, allowing them to fight Kima and the demons in their home territory. This kind of story could heavily explore Rumi's demonic side and her abilities as a half-demon, while also expanding on the history of her parents. As Rumi travels through the demon realm, she could meet demons who once knew her father, giving her new insight into who he truly was and what happened in the past. Since fighting through the demon realm and ultimately destroying Kima would be a massive undertaking, this storyline could easily continue over several movies. Perhaps the Huntrix girls only managed to weaken Kima rather than fully destroy him, forcing future generations of hunters to eventually finish the fight. Since the hunters would become occupied with the war inside the demon realm, instead of focusing on their musical careers, the honeymoon itself could begin to weaken, making their mission even more dangerous. I'm not sure how Kima himself could actually be killed, but one possibility is that if he becomes weakened enough, he could lose much of his power and be forced into a more vulnerable state. Weakening his army and depriving him of the souls he feeds upon could slowly accomplish that. The hunters could also persuade demons to turn against Kima, with the Huntrix girls exploiting the demon's resentment toward him, and sparking a civil war within the demon realm to even out the playing field. Of course, I doubt the writers would fully commit to any of these exact plot directions, but these are only the core plot possibilities for the sequel. Once you start delving deeper into the characters themselves, there are even more narrative opportunities to build from. As I mentioned earlier, Rumi discovering and exploring her demonic powers feels almost guaranteed for the next movie, since it's both a logical progression for her character and an interesting direction that the story could take. Seeing Rumi fight demons while using her demonic powers that she has come to understand and embrace would make for a great evolution of her character, and I'm fairly confident that the sequel will move in that direction. I also think that learning more about Rumi's parents and family history, whether through Celine or another source, is almost certain to happen as well. Even though Zoe and Mira were not developed to the same extent as Rumi, they still received subtle character development throughout the first movie. Mira and Zoe would almost definitely grow much closer to Rumi, and because of that, the entire group could start to feel even more like a family. One thing the first movie was arguably missing were the slower and quieter moments between the three girls. The sequel has the perfect opportunity to slow things down a little, and really focus on those character interactions, because that emotional connection is what would make the group dynamic feel even stronger and more authentic. It also feels almost guaranteed that the sequel will give us more insight into Mira's and Zoe's personal backgrounds. There's still so much about both of them that hasn't been explored yet, and expanding on their pasts could add a lot more emotional weight to the story moving forward. What's especially interesting is that Zoe's parents are the only ones who are never shown or even mentioned in the first movie. That could potentially imply that she was adopted, or maybe she just has a difficult relationship with her family, like Mira. If the sequel chooses to explore the idea that Zoe was adopted, it could add a much deeper layer to Zoe's character At the same time, Mira's emotionally reactive personality and Zoe's overly energetic nature will likely be explored in much greater depth in the sequel as well. Those personality traits already play a huge role in how both characters interact within the group, but the sequel could take things even further by showing the emotional reasons behind why they act the way they do. That kind of character development would not only make Mira and Zoe feel more complex, but it would also strengthen the emotional parallels within the group's dynamics. In any case, these are simply my own ideas as to how the sequel could potentially unfold. If the actual writers of the sequel ever saw this, they would probably just burst out laughing, since I highly doubt that something like a military intervention by the Korean government was ever part of their plans. Still, I am genuinely excited to see what direction the sequel to K-pop Demon Hunters ultimately takes, because the first film ended up being the biggest positive surprise among the movies released in 2025. And as a franchise, K-pop Demon Hunters definitely carries a lot of potential, and not just monetarily, but storytelling and character-wise.